The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclecs Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
This hour's session is how to be legally sound. This hour, we will show you how to navigate the many aspects of podcasting and not get sued. So let's meet your host. Landis Wade was an attorney for 35 years before replacing the courtroom for a podcast studio in 2018. He's now 2 years and 150 episodes into his life as host of the Charlotte Readers podcast, recently named one of the best podcasts in Charlotte. At the end, we look forward to answering audience questions. While we ask that your audio remains muted for the session, we would like for you to leave your questions in the Zoom chat box. And you can also introduce yourself and put where you're from or where you're tuning in from in there as well. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can towards the end of the hour. A reminder to the audience that this session will be recorded and made available over email. So be sure to check your emails, including your spam and junk folders, because this session's recording will be emailed to you after the festival is over. We encourage you to check out the full list of sessions in the Charlotte Podcast Festival website and share about this session on social media using hashtag CLT Podcast Fest. And even support the festival by purchasing a brand new Charlotte Podcast Festival shirt, which I'm wearing from our website. That's charlottepodcastfestival.com. With that said, let's get started.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me tonight. I'm Landis Wade. I'm happy to be here, and thanks to this podcast festival. I've really enjoyed attending all the sessions, and it's been a lot of fun, actually, and thanks to the sponsors as well. Thanks, Sarah and Joni and Brian for having me tonight. You know, I'm going to share my screen here, and as I do, I'm thinking about that song, I Fought the Law and the Law Won, by The Clash, and it's kind of this thing that we don't want to talk about. By the way, you'll see on the front of this presentation here, I'm not your lawyer, but nonetheless, I'm going to give you some information here today that you can use, and I was thinking, and this slide here, I can resonate with this slide for this reason. There are 331 million people in the U.S., at least I think that's the census, and there are about 1,330,000 lawyers. Now, the good news is that since about 2015, that number hasn't changed, so we're not adding to the mix. But, that's about one lawyer for every 255 people. Some would say that's kind of, too many, but I heard that about 500 people signed up for this. So we're not over lawyering, at least this particular session, but I was with this idea of muting all the lawyers and not really wanting the lawyers to talk. Tom Paxton, you may have heard, he's a singer-songwriter. He wrote a song in 1985, 1 Million Lawyers and Other Disasters. And it's got some great lyrics in it, in the sense that, and of course, I'm using this as an illustration because it's for educational purposes. We're talking about copyright today. But he said, "Oh, a suffering world cries for mercy as far as the eye can see. Lawyers around every bend in the road, lawyers in every tree, lawyers in restaurants, lawyers in clubs, lawyers behind every door, behind windows and potted plants, shade trees and shrubs." He's even got lawyers on pogo sticks. The point is, we can't escape lawyers, right? I mean, I'm trying to escape from being a lawyer after 35 years as a trial lawyer, and I now call myself a recovering trial lawyer. And while I would like to talk to you about podcasting and what goes into it and the fun things I do on my show on Charlotte Readers Podcast and how I get guests and everything, somebody's got to talk about legal stuff. And it just so happens, I'm a lawyer and a podcaster, so they asked me to do this. One of the reasons I know that lawyers kind of interfere with, fun things like podcasting is some of the things I have on the screen here. You may not remember, if you're young, this thing called Napster, but Napster was how you always got free music online. And if you're old enough like me, you were probably out there downloading music. Well, that's what they call copyright infringement, which we're going to talk about tonight. And also, when you talk about lawyers, you talk about podcasting, it's just not fun. Everybody, you could say, well, everybody does this. I'm just a hobbyist, and ignorance is really better, right? But I'm going to have to tell you, we're going to talk about some legal issues just so that you can spot some issues and be aware of the kind of things you should be thinking about. Why you should be interested is what I've got on this slide. Of course, you're here, so I'm glad you're interested enough to come talk with me tonight about these legal issues. But you're broadcasting audio to the public. We're going to be talking about things like trademark, copyright, your podcast name. If you violate trademark, can be used against you. What you say, if you defame someone, can be used against you. What you broadcast in terms of music, video, text, if you violate copyright, can be used against you. And if you interview guests like I do on Charlotte Reader's podcast, it's an interview show where I interview authors about their books. You're going to want permission. In my case, it involves permission to read their books and post about their books. And I'm going to talk about the guest agreement I use later in the show to address that concern. But all of these things are reasons that you might want to care about the legal issues. But having said that, I want to just lay something out here at the beginning. It's just because there are legal issues out there, it's not something we should be afraid of. Honestly, I was not a copyright lawyer. I was not a trademark lawyer. I was a trial lawyer. I'm familiar with a lot of these concepts and principles, but I've had to learn and focus on a few of these things too. And the point is, you just need to have a good antenna. You need to be able to spot what might be an issue of concern so that you can think about it, buy your lawyer friend a beer and get some, free legal advice that's not really legal advice like we're doing tonight. And, just try to find out whether you're on the straight and narrow. The legal concepts we're going to talk about tonight are varied. And if I'm going, if I'm talking too fast, I apologize. I know there are going to be some questions tonight, potentially. I'll probably cover some slides faster than others because I think copyright's probably a bigger area of interest than maybe trademark. But generally speaking, you don't have to be an expert to think practically about these issues. You just need to be cautious. And the one thing I want you to, y'all have heard that the word assume, it can be turned into an acronym, make an ass out of you and an ass out of me when you assume something. Well, don't assume things when it comes to podcasting. Don't assume, for example, that just because somebody else does it, it's okay for you to do it. Don't assume that because something's published on YouTube, then it's okay for you to record it, put it on your podcast. It's not, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. There may be other people out there that really are, as I say on this slide, they're out on a limb and they're not risk-free. But having said that, you might have certain risk tolerance levels. If you are a podcast that's well-funded, you got lawyers on staff, you're making a lot of money in sponsorships, yeah, okay, you're going to take a little more risk than someone who's just getting started. All right, that's the sort of be attentive, but don't be fearful thought here. Anybody who has, and I've heard this in some of the sessions coming up that I listened to. I heard it yesterday, and I think in the one that Stacey Sims and Brian Baltashevich did on sponsorship. And that is, think of your podcast like a business, even if it's not a business. Because if you're going to put out a podcast, you're going to put it out to the world, and you've heard this in other presentations, you want to have decent quality in a number of areas. You want decent quality audio. You might want decent quality interviews, decent quality guests. You also want decent quality, management of what you're doing. And unfortunately, that requires some thought about the legal side of things. You certainly can run it as a sole proprietorship in your name without, incorporating or creating an LLC. But if you want to protect yourself from individual liability in some areas, primarily in contract law, because I have to tell you that even if you form an LLC or a corporation, if you defame somebody, it's not going to protect you personally. That's a tort. But in contract law, you're going to be protected. If you have a sponsorship problem, you have a problem with a creditor, you have a problem with your advertising, you have a problem with something else that's online. They can't sue you personally. They have to sue your entity if you set up an entity. Now, it used to be that it was just, corporations, what they call C corporations, but the law got creative and formed what they call an LLC, and many of you may be familiar with this. I set up a single member managed LLC. It's called a limited liability company. Most states have this. If you're not from North Carolina, you set it up like a corporation, but it's actually a disregarded legal entity for tax purposes. So whatever income you make from it just flows through to your tax return, and whatever your losses you want to report, which is kind of what I've been doing in the first 2 years because I've been spending more money than I've been bringing in. That goes to the bottom line of your personal tax return in terms of a loss. But it doesn't cost that much to set up. In North Carolina, filing fee is $125, and every year you file a $202 fee, to update your filing statement. And you got to have an operating agreement, but this is a simple form that you can put together. And I would also recommend that you have a separate bank account for your LLC. And as I said, why do this? Why go to this trouble? Although it's not really that much trouble. If you got a lawyer friend, they can find it. Some of the forms you can get online with the Secretary of State. Why do it? Generally because it protects you from personal liability for creditors of your podcast. If you plan to monetize at any point in time, I recommend that you go ahead and set up a disregarded legal entity of some type. Now, some states may be different. You may, if you have a tax issue, you could talk to your lawyer about it. But for the most part, an LLC might be a good fit for you. If you're going to monetize, set it up that way so that when you enter into contracts with your sponsors or people that are advertising on your show, you can do it in the name of Charlotte Readers Podcast LLC, or I Talk a Lot LLC, or whatever you name your podcast LLC. You can do it that way. All right. Let's go to this. Let's talk trademark law for a minute. I've got a couple of slides on trademark law. And by the way, I'm not able to chew gum and talk at the same time when it comes to these chats. So I'm going to just wait till the questions pop up at the 45-minute mark here and kind of go through these slides for you. But certainly keep those questions coming, and Sarah will help me, go through those for you. So slide 6 and 7 that I'm on here deal with trademarks. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because trademarks primarily come into play for podcasting when you're naming your podcast. You don't want to use a podcast name that is trademarked or in use, and you don't want to use a mark that some other company is using because then you could get sued for trademark infringement. Now, a name doesn't have to be registered with the Uniform Trademark Corporation. I mean, in nationally, it doesn't have to be registered to have trademark protection, but it can be if you're looking to have a long-term situation. You just need to find a name that really doesn't, look like somebody else's name or sound like somebody else's name. Pick a name that nobody else is using. And I say in this third bullet, it really would be boring, I think, for me and you to get into a discussion about, what can and can't be trademarked. We'd have to talk about the strength of the mark, the distinctiveness, and how generic. What I say is, let's look for a name that nobody's using, and here's how you can do it. Conduct a name search. Go to Apple Podcasts. Certainly, even if you don't do anything else, search Apple Podcasts for your podcast name. You will find, though, that there are podcasts by the same name, just like there are books by the same name. Because for the most part, a name like that, unless it's, got something unique about it, is difficult to trademark or copyright. Search Google, search name.com. And as I said, this slide's going to be available later to you. You don't have to make all these notes, but search your Secretary of State's office. Search namecheck.com and the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Here's a search function there for that. And again, why search? Well, avoid disputes and confusion. The last thing you want to do is get, a year or two into your podcast, and, assuming we can all make it to a year or two, because there's a lot of burnout in podcasting. But let's go on the positive side. You're going to make it. You're going to make it a year or two. And when you make it, you want to make sure that, your name has got a brand influence, and you don't want to have violated someone's trademark. I think I'm going to kind of move on beyond trademarks because you'll have all this information for searching. If you really want to get into the nitty gritty of trademarking something, because, this is going to be a career for you and you really want to protect that mark, then you probably are going to want to talk to a trademark lawyer to go through the steps to file it with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. But since we're broadcasting, let's change the subject here for a minute. I've got a couple of slides here. Since we talk a lot on podcasts, we can be apt to get ourselves in trouble. if you don't do these things live, you've got the benefit, of course, of listening when you're through and editing out whatever defamatory statements you may have let leak into your podcast. But for the most part, defamation is a spoken form of well, I'm sorry, let me back up. Slander is a spoken form of defamation. Libel is the written form of defamation. So if you slander somebody, on the podcast verbally, or you put it in your show notes in writing, either one can be defamation. You want to break it down. You want to know what it is. Basically, it's what you were told when you were a child. Just tell the truth. Now, of course, we know that there are a lot of nuances when it comes to the truth and what the truth is and what the truth isn't. But a false statement that you publish that can be harmful to one's reputation is defamation. Now, you may say, well, I'm not big enough. Nobody's going to care. Well, we got to assume that somebody's listening, and hopefully you're going to get, enough downloads that people will listen, and it's always going to be up there. So what you say, as I said before, can be held against you. There are certain per se categories in North Carolina and in other states. You call somebody a prostitute, they don't even have to prove any special damages. They just have to prove that you said it, and they can ask for punitive damages. You say that somebody has an infectious disease, same thing in North Carolina. You don't even have to prove that it caused them any damage. If you impeach a person in their trade or business, again, per se, they just have to give punitive damages. But again, I go back to the basic rule here when I'm talking about defamation with people who are in podcasting, or when you're writing your show notes when we're talking about libel. And that is, just be conscious that when you're speaking, try to speak the truth as much as possible. Maybe that's a good thing to be talking about in this day when we're about a week away from the election. Speak the truth as much as possible. And I'm not going to get into anything political here about that, but I think it's a good rule to have. There are exceptions, right? Or protections, so to speak, when it comes to defamation. And some people want to know, okay, so, if someone's a public official, there is a famous Supreme Court case, Times versus Sullivan. If someone is a public figure, then they have to prove actual malice on your part. Something you got negligently wrong, or something that you made a mistake on with regard to a public official, is not going to subject you to the same kind of liability than would if you just defame someone like me, who's not famous, not a public figure. So tips as to these third parties: tell the truth, be cautious about the source of your information. And I say that because if you get on your podcast and you say, well, it was reported on such and such that this person did X, Y, and Z. Well, just because you're reporting that someone else did it, unless it's a state agency, all right, or it's a legal document that you're reporting from, you're republishing that information. And your republication of it is a publication in and of itself. So just because somebody else did it doesn't protect you from being, the third or fourth or fifth defendant in a lawsuit when it comes to defamation. I'm not trying to say any of this to scare you, because I really think the percentage of podcasters getting sued for defamation is pretty small. A lot of older people that we might defame hadn't figured out how to listen to a podcast yet, right? So we're not going to worry about that. But if you're on a news show, maybe you want to seek some legal advice about your reporting, because you're going to be putting out information regularly about public figures and people that maybe haven't become public figures. And as to your guest, we're going to talk about guest agreements in just a moment here, but a release of claims would be nice with your guest. So if your guest thinks you've said something in the podcast that is offensive to them, you've covered that in your guest agreement. And I'm going to shift gears now to something I think is really important. I'm going to talk about it for about 4 slides here. I don't know how many people use a guest agreement on podcast. I think it's probably a very small percentage, because podcasting, as you know, sort of grew out of radio. And on radio, you'd have somebody on. It might be a news show. It might be a local show that's got their own lawyers and their own, liability insurance and so forth. And they're maybe not as particular when they have a guest on a radio show about getting them to sign off on anything. But that's a radio show where they come on and they speak and then they're off. You're publishing a podcast that's going to be up and out and remain up and out for some period of time, you hope, because you'll get trailing downloads on your episodes, going forward. So what do you want to have as a podcaster? These are some rights you want to have when you're dealing with guests on your show. You want to have the right to use and distribute their voice. Now, it sounds kind of simplistic to say you want to have the right to do that, because isn't that what all podcasters do? They just get somebody on, they interview them. Why do they have to have the right to do that? I'll speak to that in just a moment. You also want to have the right to use and distribute the guest's name, their image, and their likeness, perhaps in your show notes or in social media posts and that kind of thing. And you want to have the right, like on my show, Charlotte Reader's Podcast, I have the guests read from their books on the show. I might also publish a few excerpts from their books. So I want to have the right to do that on the show. And I will talk about what I did in my guest agreement regarding that. You also want to have the right to distribute perhaps some of the photos and music. I have an episode that came out today with one of the first female executives of a music studio in Nashville. And we had music on, and we played some of the music that went along with her memoir. And so I got a release, with regard to the music as well. So those are the rights you want. Now, how do you get those rights? Most people who are podcasters, I believe, I haven't taken a poll, but it'd be interesting to know, how many people who are listening have thought about this or are thinking about putting something together. Probably what most people do, they think it's implied. If they're going to be on my show, they've given me permission. And sometimes it's, the host might go as far as to say, hey, is it okay if I, use your photograph or your likeness or distribute your voice or whatever? And those are fine, but I would say, I used to do other talks that were much less interesting, because I was an employment lawyer too, about, how employers should handle issues with employees. And there was an old saying, if it ain't written, it ain't. That is, if you don't write down, that the employee was having problems in the workplace, it's pretty hard to prove later that they were if you had a practice for documenting things. It's kind of the same thing, I think, when it comes to podcasting here on this. If you didn't write it down, it doesn't exist. And if the person who's coming back to you has an issue with what you're doing, you've got nothing to point to except your recollection of the conversation, which I can guarantee you in that circumstance, they're going to have no recollection of, right? I mean, they're not going to recall that they said, sure, that'd be fine. Or they're going to have a change of heart. And I have had a couple of times where I've had somebody come back and say, I'd like you to take this out of the show, or I really don't like the way I sounded there. Or, I even had one person, the photograph you took, it wasn't my good side. And I'm like rolling my eyes in the back of my head as I'm thinking about this. I'm like, come on, and anyway, so what I say to you is express permission is better than implied permission and oral permission. And the best way to get that is in writing. And the reason podcasters aren't asking for this is because why? It feels too legalistic. If I put something in front of somebody to sign, they might not come on my podcast. I've worked through those issues, and I'm going to give you a couple of tips about that in just a second. Why podcasters do ask for it, it leaves no doubt as to the rights of the parties, and it avoids disputes, and it avoids these problems I was talking about later. I mean, suppose you have a guest on your show and they become really famous later, and they say, I'm much better now than your podcast. And I didn't sound that good back then. I'd like you to take this down. Well, maybe you've got a guest agreement that doesn't give them the right to make that demand. Let's talk about those agreements just a second. I'll get a drink of water here. Excuse me. So, being a lawyer, I suffer from a lot of things, having gone through my life as a lawyer. Sometimes one of them is perfectionism, which I'm trying to get over. The other is trying to document things. And so I went these various stages of how to document this, and the first agreement was way too long. I looked at several agreements that the ABA used and others used, and I frankly found they weren't very good. They missed out on some things. I'll tell you now that you can find my guest agreement on my website at charlottereaderspodcast.com. if you go to the submission page, because I have a submission page for authors to submit to be on the show. If you go to that submission page on the podcast and scroll down, you'll actually be able to click on and see my current version of the guest agreement. And the way I've solved the problem, I think I've solved the problem of handing a one-page document to somebody either right before or right after we record and having them, frown at me for doing that. I have a system now to where I've set it up that when they submit, they check a box that says they've read and agreed to the terms of the guest agreement. Very simple. And I have to tell you, even though being a lawyer, I was on the phone with my web guy this week and I said, now, all those things are being saved, aren't they, in the back office of WordPress? And he said, well, no, you've got the free version. And I'm like, shit, excuse me. But I'm like, what the, I said, well, pay for it. He said, what does it cost? He says, like, I don't know, $70 a year. I said, well, let's get it, let's get it. So anyway, now it's going to preserve those when they, use the submission form, and I'll be able to make sure I keep it. In the past, I have been copying them manually, putting them in files and all that kind of thing. So that's how they do it. And if I have somebody that I invite to be on the podcast, what I say is, hey, would you mind going to this link, fill it out. It's got the contact information on there. It has, you put a little information about your bio in there. And when they do, they've got to check that box, which has them agree to my guest agreement. I've interviewed probably, as Sarah said, I've just released my 150th episode, but I've interviewed in those 150 episodes about 180 authors, and only one time did somebody complain about signing the guest agreement. And what did I do? I politely and courteously said, well, I'm sorry, I can't have you on my show. The publisher thought my agreement was fine, but for some reason, the author got skittish and didn't want to sign it. So, as I said, there's a submission page. We'll talk about the kind of things that are on it in just a second. But I find that having this agreement, having the one-page agreement is a great way to show a couple of things. It shows you're professional. It shows that you're thinking about these issues. And if you've got a show like I do, let's say you do something unique to where you want to make sure that whatever they're giving you the right to use, you're going to preserve their copyright. I actually put a clause in my guest agreement that told my authors that their copyright to their written work is preserved and that they can make their own audio recordings. And just because they're giving me the rights that they're giving me for this audio and this podcast doesn't affect that in any way. So that's another thing to think about. All right. So in my guest agreement, you'll see it when you go to it, but this is what I get. I get a perpetual worldwide irrevocable royalty-free license to the unlimited use of their name, biography, image, and likeness, and the voice recordings that we do. And they give me the permission to record with them, and that I own the podcast, and that their copyright is preserved. And this is important, they're not compensated. Sometimes people assume if they come on your show, you're going to pay them something. I'm trying to build, because my expenses, as I said, are way ahead of my earnings at this point, because I've got a social media team and a publicist. I'm trying to do it right. I'm kind of like that radio show in the first year that doesn't do any advertising. You want to build it up and then you can make something happen with it. But to do that, I'm doing a Patreon page too. And I'm slowly building patrons for listener supported episodes that I do some exclusive content. And so my guest agreement actually covers all those platforms. It covers anything I do on social media, anything I do on Patreon. So when that author signs that, if they appear on my regular free podcast and hang around to do, an author talk on a craft or business of writing from a Patreon page, I'm covered. They know they're not getting paid for it. And if I ever do make any money, they're not going to come back later and ask me for a piece of it. Finally, the parties mutually release each other of all claims related to the podcast. Now, I spent more time on that probably than most people would, but I think it's important. I think you should think about it. I think you should think about a system to make it simple for the guests that appear on your show, so it doesn't feel, too legalistic as you're putting it. The next, I think 10 minutes I'm going to spend primarily on copyright, because there are a lot of issues involving copyright that come into play with any kind of media, but also in particular podcasting. Okay, so what is copyright? Basically, it's original works of authorship. Anything that's in a fixed, tangible medium of expression, That can be literature. It can be music. It can be dramatic work. It can be pictures, graphics, sculpture. It can be movies, audio, visual, and of course, for podcasting, sound recordings. Your work, your sound recording is copyrighted. When you record a podcast, you don't have to put the big C on it. It's copyrighted when you produce it and put it out into the world. When others do the same thing, their work is copyrighted. When somebody creates a video and loads it on YouTube, it's copyrighted. So let's see if what I did here. Yes. So when you're thinking about copyrighted works and it comes into play, and I know you're thinking about the kind of things we're talking about. Okay, can I use music? Can I use somebody's voice that I heard on TV or YouTube on the internet or whatever? Here's 5 don'ts for copyright. Don't copy other people's work. Don't distribute their work. Don't display their work. Don't publicly perform their work. Don't make derivatives of their work unless you can make it into a parody or something that's transformative, that actually takes it beyond, what it is. Thank Sarah, what's her name, who does the Donald Trump word, where she mimics Donald Trump and she's talking. That's transformative. His team actually thought about suing her for making him look bad. We're not going to talk about what that would take, but in any event, because that's transformative, she's protected. So as a podcaster, you don't want to play songs or videos that belong to others unless what? Unless you've got a license, right? And you don't want to incorporate or modify other people's work without a license. And what is a license? A license is essentially a written agreement that allows you to use that work in a way that you want to use it. It could be an exclusive license. It could be a non-exclusive license. Now, if you produce the music yourself as a work for hire, for example, you hire a friend of yours who is a musician to create your work, it might be good to create a little work for hire and pay them or whatever, or at least confirm that that's what they're doing. And in that case, you own the work. It's your work to then distribute. So a couple of basic rules to think about when you're talking about copyright. Now, people ask, well, where do I get my music then? If I can't just copy it like we used to do on Napster, if I can't just steal it from the internet like everybody else is doing, at least I heard, how do I do it? Well, I went to this place called incomptech.com, and there are other places on the internet that you can get music, but I found my theme music here. And I found out in researching this that there are 2 types of licenses for this music online. There's the Creative Commons license, and there's the standard license. And you'll find this whenever you go to buy music or use it online. Creative Commons requires you, if they have that license for the work that you're downloading, you've got to give attribution to the artist every time you use it. And it's got to be somewhat prominent in terms of where you place it. I didn't want that because I didn't want to have to mention the artist's name every time I played the music. So what I did was I paid about $30. It was pretty cheap to get a standard license for the music that I play all the time and the intro and the mid rolls for my show. And that's been fine for me. And I did a little thing because I'm an author too, and I've written some books where lawyers save Christmas. It's kind of a cross between My Cousin Vinny and Miracle on 34th Street. And so I went and I got some theme music that was Christmas related, and I put that out in my podcasting Christmas and paid, $5 or $10 for it. But think about that. Think about, finding, it's kind of fun. It's kind of like a treasure hunt to go find this music online. And when you pay for it, you feel good about it. Be sure that when you get that license, download it, put it in your file on your computer, make a copy of it just so you have it. And then as far as graphics go, you can't steal graphics either. The place I go, and it was like things changed for me when someone introduced me to canva.com. I don't get anything from canva.com, but I found that Adobe was kind of hard for me to work with. Canva's, hell, if I can do it as a recovering trial lawyer, anybody can do it. So I create my graphics there, and it's an annual membership. I don't know. I think it's $150 or something a year, and it's a nice way to get graphics. So what's not protected? We could spend a lot of time on this, and I know a lot of people want to talk about this because they want to use stuff for free, right? You don't want to pay for it. And, essentially, and we can talk about this thing up here, ideas, procedures, processes, systems, or whatever are not protected. It's the expression of the idea, not the idea itself. So I use an example here, a podcast that features a boy who goes to school for wizards, or a boy who does, who can fly, that doesn't infringe the Harry Potter or Superman books, unless you're trying to, really put Harry Potter's image or Superman's image up on your screen. But here's the one that people talk about a lot. Work that's in the public domain. If it was published before a certain date, I've got the date on here, you're generally free to use it. If sometimes on the internet, they'll say it's dedicated to the public domain and you can use that. But this is a big rule here. Public domain does not mean material on the internet, i.e. YouTube. You can link to videos on YouTube, but you can't claim them as your own. In fact, there's a whole thing about YouTube, where people can file infringement claims. And, if you're a YouTuber or you're posting stuff on YouTube and you have an infringement claim, I think they got 3 strikes and you're out. And if you have a big business on YouTube, you're putting your podcast there and you're stricken from the platform. That could be a problem for you. So what's fair use? This is the other big thing people like to talk about. I like to say this when I talk about fair use, because people say, well, that's fair use in it. I can use that. I say, yeah, as long as you got a lawyer on staff, it's a 4-part test. It's not a bright line rule when it comes to fair use. And somebody says, well, I just used a little bit of it. I only used, this much. Well, the part you may have used may be an integral part of that entire piece. So that's an issue. But when you're thinking about it, you got to look at these 4 factors. And when you're talking about this third bullet here, the amount that's being used, it's quantity alone is not really the issue. Quality comes into play too. And word of warning, if you don't have that license and you aren't sure, as I say, you probably should talk to a lawyer or hire a lawyer. But let me just give you some, examples of when fair use is favored and when it's not in these categories. Fair use is favored if you're doing a podcast where you're teaching something, or you're using it to research something, or you're a nonprofit, or it's criticism, or, as I said, parody, or news reporting. That's where fair use is favored. Fair use is not favored when it's commercial activity. If you're trying to make a profit, you're trying to, get advertising, whatever, or it's for entertainment purposes. Because then you're just basically borrowing and stealing someone else's work to try to make yourself look good or make money off someone else's work. But if you're doing it for educational purposes, or you're you're doing a parody, that's different. The amount of the use, if it is a small amount, a small portion that's not really central or significant, then fair use is favored. It's not favored when you use a large chunk of it, or if the person that you decide to use, even if small, is central to or at the heart of the work. So just be conscious about, when somebody says, well, we're going to do this because it's fair use, and, other people have done it for that same reason. Just, let your antenna go up and think about that. All right. I'm getting close to, we got a few minutes left here, and I've got this is my last slide. This is good. We'll have time for questions. This slide encompasses a lot of different things. I feel like I've been throwing information at you, out of a fire hose here, but it is what it is, as John Fox used to say, if you were a Panthers fan years ago when he was stumbling along. The legal agreements that you have, I would say, must be clear and specific. And I've already talked about a couple of these. You could have a separate publicity release. I think WFAE had one for maybe even this Charlotte Podcast Festival I signed. It was pretty simple. You sign it. We're going to be able to use your image and your likeness, and don't sue us. You might have a separate liability release. My guest agreement combines all those things. It combines the publicity release, the liability release, and the right to use the audio. I think the word I used before, which was on some guest releases, was in perpetuity. I think that scared away the one person. I don't know why they thought they'd live in perpetuity, but anyway, I took that word out because if you give an irrevocable license, it's the same thing. I just took out a big word that had too many syllables and sounded too lawyerly, and I accomplished the same thing. All right, so contracts for services. You're going to have some if you're running this as a business. You might have somebody that's editing your work for you. You might have someone that's helping you produce it. You might have a graphic designer. You might have a publicity manager, social media manager, and you might have a contract with them for the services they're going to provide, the deadlines when payments due, the amount of the payment, and how you can terminate those arrangements. So it's good to have, it doesn't have to be overly complicated, but the basic elements of a contract are, offer, acceptance, and consideration. And the best way to confirm it is in writing. So, I'm going to do X for you. I'm going to pay you Y, and it's going to go for this period of time, or it's going to be month to month or day to day, and either party can terminate, as they will, as long as you're paid up for, when you finish the work you're doing. And then there's sponsorship and advertising contracts. If you're working with a big sponsor, they might have their own contract. But, I did a little bit of, I've got a sponsorship, the library, Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. I'm thankful and appreciative they help sponsorship since I do the author show. And they've got an agreement of their own that I signed. But then I did some mid-roll spots with people, and I'd have to create my own sort of one-page advertising contract and think about some things like, okay, when's the ad going to run? What's it going to cost? What's the length of the ad going to be? Is it going to be an ad that, I speak in my voice, or are you going to want to put the ad, in the voice of the client? Are you going to get a third party? So all these things change the cost and change what you're going to do. And just having it in writing reduces, any disputes that might come up, about what you promised and what you got. The other thing I thought about was, how long does it have to stay up on your podcast? Because, 6 months from now, you might repurpose some of this content. So I have a provision in there that, I'll keep it up for X period of time. Even though it'd be too much trouble for me to go back and change it, I probably never will. So, gosh, I think I'm right at, Sarah, I think I'm right at the 7:43 mark, and I got through my slides. So I'll give you a pat on the back there. And so,
okay.
let me take this screen share down here, and we'll do questions now.
All right. Are we ready for some questions? Let's see. Okay. So let's see. Let me start from the top. Okay. Courtney asks, would you file a separate LLCs for every podcast you own if you host more than one?
So that's a good question. I would not, unless you're a really big operation. I think you can have an LLC that performs. You could call your LLC like a network LLC that has any number of podcasts in it. For example, I'm a member of the Queen City Podcast Network, proud to be a part of that. Brian Baltashevitz, they're one of the sponsors of this podcast. And I'm sure that they just operate under that one entity, for all the shows that they produce. It's probably the easiest way to do it, so you don't have to deal with, 11 different schedules on your tax return.
Okay. Deborah asks, is there a best way to set up subsidiaries?
And I'm not sure. I know where the question is going with this, but you can. A subsidiary is essentially a separate legal entity that is owned by another entity. So, for example, if I set up Charlotte Readers Podcast LLC and it's member managed by me, Landis Wade, I'm really the sole shareholder, for lack of a better word. But Charlotte Readers Podcast LLC could set up another entity called Charlotte Readers Podcast. I don't know. We'll say Author YouTube LLC, and own it, and you'd have a subsidiary. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but that's how you would do it. You would just set up another entity and have it owned by the parent entity itself.
Okay. Well, we have a question from someone who's wondering if we've already started our podcast as individuals, how do we transfer the intellectual property to LLC once formed? Like a capital contribution?
Yeah, that's a good question. Y'all are, you're talking to a recovering trial lawyer. I was the one who always dealt with the battles when people didn't do things right. But I will say this, if you've got, now run that by me one more time, sir. I want to make sure I get this right.
Okay.
Question.
If we've already started our podcast as individuals, how do we transfer the
Got it.
intellectual property once the
So-
LLC is formed?
Right. You just set up your LLC, and then you as the individual just have a simple document that, transfers all of the right, title, and interest to the intellectual property that you had as an individual to this entity, and then you're done. And again, by the way, this is not legal advice, but take it for what you will.
Okay. Sounds good. This one's from Stephanie. Is the rule about playing a minimum number of seconds of copyrighted music without potential penalty real?
So is the penalty real? The penalty is real if you have an infringement claim made against you. Typically, you're going to probably get a takedown notice first. So if you've put something up and you're not a big fish and you're not really, making lots and lots of money, you might get a takedown notice. And then you have to go to the trouble of going in, taking that podcast down, removing everything that you put up there. If you are doing well, you might also get a demand for compensation of some kind. I will tell you that, copyright infringement is real. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but in the last 2 days, I mentioned I was an author, but we've been working on my ebook promotion for Christmas. And I found out somebody went in on Amazon, took my story, put a new book cover on it, and they're selling it on Amazon and on Barnes and Noble. So I had to actually go fill out a 1-page form, demanding that Barnes and Noble and, Amazon take down this offending book. I don't know. I mean, pretty brazen act on their part, but in one respect, I'm kind of honored. They liked my book enough; they wanted to sell it themselves. But I didn't much like the having to go through it.
Gotcha. Well, actually, just to clarify, that's an interesting story about your book, and I'm sorry that that's happening. But the question, I guess, part of it was, there's like a rule or a folklore, I guess, about maybe like there's a certain number of seconds, I guess, that you can play it.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah,
And is that real, or is it any amount of time you play it?
That's a fairy tale. Grimm's fairy. It's a Grimm's fairy tale. Very scary fairy tale.
Okay.
If you play it for a couple of seconds and it's central to the work, it doesn't matter how many seconds it is. That goes back to what I was talking about with fair use. There is this lore out there that people think, well, if I only play 5 seconds of it, it's not that big a deal. But that 5 seconds may be very important to that work. It may be, take whatever your famous rock song of all time is, and you play those key elements for the lead into your show, you're going to get yourself sued for something like that. So
Right.
That is folklore.
Well, you've heard it here, folks. There is no such thing as a 5-second rule. From Shauna, at what point during the creation of a podcast do you consider yourself self-employed?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear part of that, sir.
I guess at what point during the creation of a podcast do you consider yourself self-employed?
Yeah, well, you're self-employed as soon as you get started if you hadn't set up your own legal entity. So the first time you speak into that microphone and you put it out on Apple Podcast or wherever you're going to put it out, you are operating as a sole proprietor. Any money you make from that just goes to you individually, to your tax return. But it's not like you can't change it. You can get an LLC, you can sign up for one, and continue to operate, under your LLC.
Okay, sounds good. Oscar asks, I do a weekly radio show. I'm planning to turn into a podcast. My show is called Short Circuits. A Google search shows that there's a podcast called Short Circuit, not plural. Does my additional S make the name unique, or would that count as infringement?
Yeah, this is one of those questions where we go back to the front of the slide. This is not intended to be legal advice. That's kind of an interesting call. Short circuit or short circuits. It really would depend on all those factors. How distinctive is one versus the other? How long has one been operating versus the other? Is there the opportunity for it to be confusing? Potentially confusing, but if you're going to really brand that over time it's probably worth talking to someone who's a trademark lawyer about whether you can, whether you should have a concern about that. The first one, also, if you're second and they're first, that might make a difference too, because the first one to put it out there, and use it for a while makes a difference. Now, if they stop using it and don't continue to use it, then you sort of jump into first place. I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of a clarification.
Okay, that makes sense. And Deborah asks, must you get a release to read a portion of someone else's book? Should books and music be treated the same way?
Yeah, books and music should be treated the same way, in the sense that if you are, publishing, displaying, repeating with your voice someone else's copyrighted work, you've got to think about whether or not you have permission to do that. So you have to go through that exercise. What are you doing it for? Now, maybe you're running a podcast that has an educational component to it. Maybe it's a podcast that involves critique. Maybe one of the things you're doing is, thinking about whether certain books, they're written, within this last 70 years, say something about what's going on publicly, or, with respect to social justice, and you're doing a commentary on it. When you do that, you're much more likely to fall into the category of fair use than if you're reading somebody's work who's not a public figure, who doesn't want you to do it because they don't really want you to take their work and use it for your purposes, and you're doing it for entertainment purposes.
Okay, that covers that very well. Let's see. So Gomez and Teresa ask, how does copyright work when there are multiple creators or co-hosts?
Yeah, that's good. And in fact, I've had to think about something recently, because I'm going to try something new in 2021, where I have some of my previous authors come on and be guest host, and be in author conversations with other authors. And I was thinking, God, I probably got to get them to sign something. And so, as far as the permission goes, but as far as the copyright goes, if you have a podcast with somebody else and you're sharing that copyright jointly, you should have an agreement with them about the terms of that sharing arrangement. If you're doing 90% of the work and they're doing 10% of the work, you don't want them to think they got 50% ownership of the copyright. And you can actually, by agreement, determine, just like you do with licensing work, the relative ownership of a copyrighted work.
Okay. This is from Sapna. My business is an LLC, so is my podcast covered under that?
Yeah, so the business is an LLC, and if you're running the podcast as part of your business and it operates in connection with the business, I think you have a pretty good, and basically, if you got the expenses and the earnings, running into your business, with your podcast, it probably could be considered part of that. But you may also want to, somewhere on your website or in your social media or something, say on the bottom, it could be in the small print at the bottom, such and such podcast, an operation of. Now, a lot of times, maybe a law firm has a podcast, or, a real estate firm has a podcast. They don't need to set up, if they don't want to, a separate LLC. They might, because they want to separate it from any potential exposure for the entity. If it's going to be a big operation, you could do it, but you could also fold it in under what you're doing.
Okay. Shannon wants to know, what type of lawyer do I need to hire for the purposes of my podcast?
A really, really good lawyer. No, I'm just kidding. So if you want to hire a lawyer for your podcast, it really depends on what you're going to be asking them to do. Are you asking them to help you with, some contract work? Well, find a basic corporate lawyer who knows about contracts. If you're going to do something a little more, I would say when you get into intellectual property like trademark, copyright, I wouldn't go to just a basic contract or corporate lawyer unless they have that expertise. There are IP lawyers out there that do that kind of work solely. And so those, it depends. And if you're looking for if you're a news show and you need help on sort of getting some really good guidelines, for how not to get sued for defamation, talk to a media lawyer. There are a lot of those out there too.
All right. Sounds good. So you have a lot of choices on those. Okay, so Stephanie asks, can you recite a portion of a song's lyrics, like not sing it and not play the music? I guess it would kind of like a poem.
I did at the beginning of this show when I was talking about that song by Paxton. Well, we'll see if I get sued or not. But seriously, I think if you use a part of it and it's for educational purposes, like what I was doing in this show here, you're much more likely to fall into the fair use. I wouldn't then take it and necessarily publish it on your website in the show notes, but just be thoughtful and reasonable about it, because I do think that depending on the degree of which you use it, you will fall under the fair use in a number of situations if you're being smart about it. And that would be an example where you probably could do it. Maybe you're having some commentary on something and you say, well, that kind of reminds me of the song, that Jackson Brown wrote that had those lyrics, and you give 2 lines or something, and they go, yeah, and I can't believe, so it kind of just feeds into the educational conversation.
Right. Okay. Kimberly asks, how do broadcast news archive clips work? Is there a time limit before the rights are needed, or is there a difference between using like audio only from those or like the full clip or full video?
Yeah, and that's getting a little tricky because I'm not sure. I mean, the actual news itself is not owned by the news entity, but maybe what they produce, their audio or the way they put it out there, you couldn't just necessarily, I don't think, reproduce, your local news station's broadcast unless they want to put it on YouTube and you put a link to it in your show notes or something. But playing it as part of your podcast is a little bit different. But if it's just the news itself that you're talking about, depending on where it's coming from, if it's coming from the government, you're pretty well protected, although that's probably a place where we can get a lot of fake news too. But anyway, from the standpoint of defamation protection, you can be protected there as well. I don't know. That is a question that has a lot of layers to it, and I could probably spend a lot more time on it. I'll just have to stop there.
Okay. So Alyssa is wondering, she hosts a fandom podcast. So she makes accompanying videos on YouTube that will reference clips from her show without original audio. How does she determine what's derivative and what's transformed from the original work?
Well, unfortunately, this goes back to that 4-factor test. When we're talking about fair use, and it's really tricky. There's not one bright line answer to a lot of these questions that you're asking, and this is one of them. Obviously, the more transformative it is, the more parody-like it is, the more chance it's going to be fair use. The more like the original work itself that it is, the less likely it's going to be treated, as transformative. That's a typical lawyer politician answer. Y'all can rate me, a 1 star out of 5 for that one. But I'm sorry, that's what I got to say.
I understand. Okay. Respecting everyone's time, we have time for one more question. So this one is from Taylor. What is a sync license and why do you need it? Or do you need it? Sorry.
I knew there'd be a question I wouldn't have any idea what the answer to the question is. A sync license?
Like SYNC.
Well, that one stumped me. Now I'm going to have to go and look up sync license now. There are a lot of different licensing options out there.
Oh, I've got a definition for you.
Okay, sure.
A synchronization license is an agreement between a music user and the owner of the copyrighted composition.
Yeah, okay. Well, that brings up a good point because a lot of times, you got to be clear of who has the rights to give to you. And sometimes if a music producer has given rights to someone else to then, spread that out over the universe, you might have to look closely to see who has the right to give you that license. And so other than to say, I'm getting a 1 star on this one too. But other than to say, go make sure that you know who's got those rights and get an agreement to use it. That's how I'd have to answer that question. And again, I go back, since this is the last question, I'll just say that on all these questions that you're having, I'm sorry we don't have time to get to all of them. But with all these questions you're having, you're asking good questions, and that's the first step. When you're asking the question, that means you're thinking about it. And then you're going to go look for the answer, and you're going to talk to other people who've done certain things, and you're going to figure it out. And if you're asking the question, you're sort of halfway there. You may be more than halfway there when it comes to protecting yourself, because you'll have a little something in the back of your head that says, well, if I don't really have the answer to this question yet, what's my default going to be? Well, my default, which is more conservative because I suffer from being a trial lawyer for so many years, is don't do it until I'm sure I'm, okay with it. But, you may have a different risk tolerance level. The point is, some of these are bright line rules, like, whether you can or cannot use somebody's written work in certain ways. Some are rules that are flexible in nature and require a balancing act to adhere to. But if you just pay attention, keep your antenna up, and you'll do fine. And hopefully this hadn't bored you to death talking to lawyers. Hopefully you'll go not hold it against me and look at my podcast and think about lawyers who ask interesting questions and deal with interesting content, like authors who write interesting and engaging books. But I want to thank everybody for being a part of this tonight. It was an honor for me to be on this Charlotte Podcast Festival, the first festival in Charlotte, and to reach out to all these people that are out there and talk, even if I had to talk about law, which I'm trying to get away from, but I'll stick it out and share some of these thoughts. Somebody wants to email me. My email address is on my website too. It's on the information here. I won't answer your legal questions, but I'm happy to talk to you about podcasting or some basic stuff, as long as you don't hold anything I tell you against me, which is my basic rule.
Okay. Hello.
Yeah. Yes, I'm here.
Good. Okay. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you for everyone who submitted questions, and let's give a big round of applause for Landis Wade. A reminder to the audience that this session has been recorded and will be made available to you as soon, or as an archive session, as soon as, I guess, I don't know exactly when, but so keep an eye on your emails, and also check your spam junk folders because it may show up there, but it's going to be after this recording. We still have a week left of free podcast sessions and panels taking place during the Charlotte Podcast Festival. So please check out the full list of sessions and speakers and register on charlottepodcastfestival.com. You can share your experience by using the hashtag CLT Podcast Fest on social media. And you can also support the festival by picking up a brand new, super soft, shirt. I don't know if you can see me, but I'm wearing it, t-shirt from our website, charlottepodcastfestival.com. Make sure to join us for the virtual podcast happy hour this Friday at 6 p.m., where you can mix and mingle with other podcasters from around the world, and register for it on charlottepodcastfestival.com. Thank you again for attending today's session, and I'm Sarah Pollock. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye, everyone.